Okay, so at this point, we're going to do a repeat of an episode that I attempted on Monday when my microphone failed on me again. But this is just another day in Coram, or Cord Coram. The city state of Cord Coram, nestled against the Wilderlands Mountains on the northern flanks of, pardon my no. I knew it was coming and I didn't get my sneeze button in time. I'll have to edit that later, or leave it in just for comedy's sake. Who knows? People sneezing is a kind of a funny thing, I suppose. But if my nose starts running again, I'll have to do my pause or break and come back here. But the idea is that, no, let me restate. Cord Coram, city-state, nestled against the northern flanks of the mountains north of Wilderlands and along the entire northern coast of Groenland, is a powerhouse in history and has been off and on for iterations. As is always the case in these Just Another Day episodes, I'm going to go through the effective history of this region and in particular of this city so that we keep kind of a tap on what's going on in the world. Now, this country's name, Coram, has shown up many times in the adventures of my players as they have found instruments or artifacts or even denizens of this area and have endeavored to muddle their way through without actually visiting this kingdom. And at this point, it's fairly well advised to remain out of the actual Vale of Coram if you can absolutely help it because of the dangers of such a volatile area. And we will go into why this area is volatile as we go along. But it wasn't always this case. If we herald back, it is not a kingdom of the first or the second iteration, really. The Valley of Coram was at that time known as the Vale of Bones, and by the very nature of its rather disparaging and scary name, most of the adventuring groups that I had wouldn't even approach the Vale of Bones, and therefore were arguably well defended against the effects thereof. But in particular, the city-state that is now Cord Coram comes into existence at the beginning of the third iteration and literally was at that point called Last Home. And it was fundamentally the place where the barbarian nations arose in terms of trade and identification. As Last Home, the unifying factor of the city-state was that it provided a safe haven when the winters got bad. As I mentioned, this is on the northern coast of Groenland, and during that iteration, this area was pretty much a snow-covered, snow-blasted plain, and fundamentally were the equivalent of high steps and simply were impenetrable during the deepest of winters and only barely passable in the best of seasons. The leadership of this area was by a series of vanquishing warlords, war chiefs, and the such that would hold the place under their control only as long as they could wrest it from the others, and then they would fall into obscurity and their antecedents would take them out and move in the area. But the region was fundamentally infested with, for lack of a better term, the Ordnung, an organization of it's actually a loose confederation of giant tribes, giantish beings, from the hill giants all the way up to the really scary ones. Ironically, the scariest ones lived on elegant floating palaces that drifted across Kordkrum. Yes, I had seen the movie Zardoz, and if you haven't, put it on your list to watch, if only for a few minutes at the beginning, because it really is a truly intolerable film. But Zardoz is a floating palace where the rich and godlike beings held sway simply by their domination of the horizon line. And I have to admit, motion pictures are great influences, and you'll probably hear me over episode after episode describing how this motion picture or that motion picture may have affected me at the time. And this area also, if you can discern the idea here, the concept of the plains, the high step-like plains really affords itself kind of a Hyperborean feel, and therefore it was the homeland of the various barbarian tribes. And yes, that includes those that might have had a character by the name of Conan, or a god by the name Karam. There's many influences that that can be seen and discovered in the world of Nycos if you A, study the maps, and B, read up on the backgrounds and the storylines of the various iterations. But in the third iteration, this high plains was controlled by a warlord chieftain who, at times, he wasn't in charge, but at other times he was, by the name of Coram. And Coram was not a direct descendant, or it was not even directly affiliated with any particular player's enjoined person. Matter of fact, the concept of the injunction didn't come about yet for quite a long time. But the idea that this would have been a populated area and controlled by somebody who had been a PC would have been counterproductive for the way in which most of my game sessions ran, because the wild hordes from the north were ubiquitous. It's historically a trend, and I was as susceptible as any other. And so not only did the giants and barbarian hordes of humans, but also the original orc chieftains and stuff also came from the north, and most of them had spent at least some time in the Vale of the Vale of Bones, which is where Kordkrum is. In that third iteration, humanity basically found itself bounded by chaos in all directions. The map wasn't yet fully developed, and it wasn't until the end of the third iteration that the map as we know it was finally formalized. At this point in time, the map of Grolland was complete, and I was working on the other maps, hence the peninsula that you see off to the right there, heading towards what is now Omara, the city, the unconfederated unions of the barbarian tribes still maintain continuous control over the valley there, and therefore allow for the trickle of transit through Coram to occur, particularly along the forested northern reaches, which are sort of antithetical to the lifestyle of the plains barbarian. During the third iteration, as a matter of fact, at no point were the champions of the age ever anywhere near this area. They remained even south of the Wilderlands and operated fundamentally in the city of Turkun, which is a completely separate video that we'll be doing soon. As we move from the third age to the fourth age, humanity had gotten its grits, so to speak, and during the fourth iteration, humanity embarked on a almost a quest-like desire to clear the Vale of Bones, because the pass through Cordcrum was the shortest passway for passing through the Wilderlands. And while the the elf population of that iteration, they hadn't yet been renamed the Eldrin, the Wilderlands elf species known as the Altons, or I was not very clever back then. The High Elves were known as the Altons, and they possessed this area all along the Wilderlands mountain range. And as elves are wont to do, they were fairly isolationist, and so therefore passing through the Vale of Bones was more of, they were actually under more of a threat by interaction with and taxation by the Daean and Altan elves that lived in those mountains. Daea, Daea, was actually the name of one of their rulers, and eventually the Altan population lost their names in favor of being known as the Daean or Daean elves for a couple of reasons. One is that their handwriting was on the wall. They were the last of the Eldrin species. I did it again. I'm so used to calling them Eldrin now. The last of the Elvish people to maintain the city of Nyx, far to the west from here, by the way, that they therefore were sort of marked for death in the fourth and later iterations, simply because they had taken such a weird name. It was like the word Gaia, Gaea, but they were instead Daea, Daea. And these Daean/Daean elves were pretty hostile, pretty wild, pretty uncaring, didn't have much to do with the surface dwellers down below. As a matter of fact, the concept of the half-elf, the Dungeons and Dragons equivalent now, is gone completely, but the original half-elves were, it was suggested that it was the mortals that were the bad guys in that structure, or that the concept of the elf who would sacrifice immortality to live with the mortals became so prolific and arguably profane that the Altons and, as a matter of fact, their more arrogant brethren, the Primus, both unilaterally decided to call the Eldrin who had been of questionable birth to be, were considered to be called Scorn, because that's literally the motif that their attitude about such beings came to be. And this concept, therefore, of the Scorn as a abandoned people also fed into some of the proto-Tolkienian viewpoints about the Numenorian peoples, that they were indeed long-lived, traveled much in the form and the style of other Eldrin species, but were arguably considering themselves above them and superior to them. And this led, therefore, to be a wide array of players who were playing characters who were basically displaced persons. And it was in this era the first use of the term murder hobos was tossed about long ago. But nonetheless, the adventuring groups that included the champions of the age, those who would eventually be the wielders of the powers of the prism, were included at least a couple of half-elves. And because of that very thing, the new adage that was added to the 6 champions was one there is that is not one, and initially it was because there was a theoretical seventh piece of the prism that was supposedly going to be wielded by this person that had qualified to be pardon me this person had qualified to be one of the heroes of the age, but did not become a wielder of one of these 6 weapons of power. And so the fourth iteration ended, I should say, in that fourth iteration, the power that grew to eventually clear out the Vale of Bones and establish the headlands for what is now Corum were the Dogs of War. And they tended to like to hunt in the area because the enemies were always sentient and still hyper aggressive. They weren't those people that like to be particular hunters, so they wouldn't necessarily pursue non-sentient creatures, no matter how plentiful they might be. But during this period, also dragons were fundamentally being hunted out of existence as well. So that by the time we get to the 5th iteration, there are no dragons exigent in the Wilderlands Mountains. There are no members of the Ordman operating in the plains of Corum either. However, they had been replaced with the half-giant known as Golian, and the Golians expanded their territories until they were actually the equivalent of the Mongol hordes, if you will. They had become so numerous that they had basically dominated the area of the plains of Corum, and it wasn't called Corum back then, plains of Corum, and established the kingdom capital in this newly developing city-state. As such, they were considered to be, based on their longevity, more wise perhaps than their mortal brethren. And so the Golians eventually established the cathedrome as their primary equivalent of the supreme courts of the world, in that it was the final arbiter of justice. If you could not get justice in other nations or in other city-states, you could petition for a champion of Corum to take up your case and fight for you in the battlefields of the Cathedrome. And it became one of the greatest training centers for individual warriors the world over. As a matter of fact, Mercania, the kingdom known as the Sellsword Rialto, eventually would broker to send students to the Corumite legal system to get more even training on the very acts of defeating and destroying an opponent. And so during the 5th iteration, ironically, even as humanity and the cultures of the world were brought low by the failure of the champions to actually rise to their duties, nonetheless, these major cities who were primary fomenters of that 5th iteration rebellion were the places that made the most profit. Cities like Tenerife and Corum and Barbas all rose to prominence due to their sordid and criminal backgrounds, despite being vaunted as the enlightened cities of its age. And the darkest of lanterns became the brightest of lights during that dark period, ultimately culminating in the devastation at the city-state known as Haven. But that's a talk for a much later iteration as well, a much later episode as well. Needless to say, the rise of Corum in that period did establish their legal system. As a matter of fact, the very concept of combat by legates to determine the outcomes of justice became ubiquitous. And to this day, most of the courts in the world have Golian protectorates and Golian defenders working those cases. So it's unified and it's shared across the planet, and yet it's arguably one of the most sordid governmental systems at all. Now, in that fifth iteration, when it ended, the fall of the governmental system of the ordning caused the breakup of the unity of this nation, and eventually it fell back to wild steppes tribes, and again the predecessors of the Olmeran people spread out in this area and reclaimed it for the human population simply on the basis of their speed and the efficiency of the horse clans that they rode in that period. The concept of the Mongolian horse and rider, and the perhaps a hybrid with the why can't I remember their nation? I play them in Civilization all the time. Scythians. Between the Scythians and the Mongols, the horse and rider combinations soon took dominance over this whole region, and the rise of the horse clans were established and led to, again, in the sixth iteration in particular, the small population groups of free traders of Corum became almost synonymous with the wildlands everywhere, because they simply exited the Vale here and dominated it in any place that they came to. Eventually, those descendants arrived in what is now Swarthir, and are the ancestors of the Swarthiri barbarians of today. During that sixth iteration, with that advance of the horse clans here, this boundary again became impassable, or nigh unto impassable, and the only saving graces with this also was the rise of the Jubilethans, and the safety of a Jubilethan caravan became watchword, and most people who traveled long distances would join themselves to one of the Jubilethan trains simply to protect themselves from the barbarian hordes. Eventually, as the sixth iteration passed on, the Olmeran peoples were finally established under Olmara, also known as Mama Roja, who established her kingdom by her efforts and diligence in maintaining and codifying the Corumite law. There still is to this day a Corumite court system, and generally it is moderated by the Golians, but as the Golians have once again gained acclaim in the ordning, they no longer consider humanity even their near brethren, and are gradually being bred out of existence as they recombine with the other giant-ish clans for name and propriety sake. When we get to the end of the seventh iteration, the main challenge is that the Cathedrome at Corum, which had now taken on that name as their leader was a seventh iteration champion who chose the path of godhood instead of remaining an accessible member of the why can't I remember names right this second? This cracks me up. The avatars of history. He chose instead the path to become a deity of law, and by developing this concept of legalese, governance and religious fervor, the followers of Cord eventually established the Torg, Lord Cord of Cord, to become their deity, as in his original man, I am losing it in terms today. He had been a follower of the more ancient and more classic D&D realms god of Cord, but that was lost as he established himself in this kingdom and dedicated himself to become just as serious a deity as that. And so the Cordite movement within the Coramite religious community grew up and eventually established the Cathedrome as their chief temple. And now all of the religious personnel throughout the rest of the world, when they go to court, swear upon the threads of cord, a document that he had created using a knotting technology similar to what is known to be the Inca people of South America here on terra firma. At any rate, the devastation, though, occurred shortly after that, when the champions of the Seventh Age took it upon themselves to attempt to undo the seeming misfortunes of history and attempted to eliminate forever the very concept of the iterations, and has tried to establish a centralized system that would reset the clocks back to session 0. Now, there's a fun piece of information about that we'll talk about in a later episode, but just know that the last of the Coramite governances, the last of their giantish leadership, fell away under the hands of Alma, the hands of Mamaroha and her people, basically decimating the giants of the region and stabilizing travel throughout the area. And that was on the direct heels of the Revening, the powerful magics released at the beginning of in the pre-8th iteration time frame. This magical effect created by the previous champions had completely eliminated all written works, and the libraries of Cord Coram, the libraries at Lexar, and a bunch of others were completely eliminated, book for book, page for page. And that devastation destroyed the overall superstructure of the Supreme Court systems of Quorum and threw the entire region into disarray and chaos for the entire period known as the Now. We'll talk about that more with another games group, and I'm going to hold off on going any farther into Quorum's past because the players are just getting ready to enter into these areas. And, oh, by the way, the Tuesday report is going to be absolutely wild for this week, so watch for that. So much good stuff is going on. So let's move on to our next section of today's show, shall we?